Okay, so thanks everybody for coming. Much appreciated. Can everyone see okay? Everyone can hear okay? Okay, cool. So hi, my name's Kyle, and I'm passionate about a framework called ServiceStack. I am a thought worker, and yeah, I'm here to talk to you about some stuff about web frameworks. And this is my friend Tanuj.
Hey guys, I'm Tanuj, Mathur. I'm passionate about a lot of frameworks. Nancy is one of them. Haven't had any experience with ServiceStack. But hopefully today we'll be introducing you to both these really interesting frameworks. Part of the inspiration for this talk was something we noticed at a number of .NET clients we worked at. For a lot of .NET devs, the search for a web framework starts and begins at ASP.NET, which is a shame, really, because the .NET ecosystem has a lot of really interesting options. And today we'll be talking about Nancy and ServiceStack, which are two of the more popular, mature ones.
So many people might ask, hopefully not us, right? But many people might ask, why even look for alternatives, right? Like, why isn't it okay to just keep going on with ASP.NET MVC or WebAPI or whatever comes in Visual Studio? And I think one of the important reasons to think about this is to move away from monoculture, right? Monoculture, at the end of the day, weakens our ecosystem and makes us even more susceptible to, if we're all thinking in the same way, then if we all miss the next big wave, then like we're all sort of going to be rolled over by that wave. Whereas if we're always looking for alternatives and we're always sort of seeking open source and other ecosystem ways to solve a problem, if we can become more like the Ruby ecosystem or the Java ecosystem, where there's almost never one true way to do anything, then I think that's good for us. I think that gets us away from this monoculture that we have been, you know, maybe it's better now, but it's still, comparatively, we're not where I'd like us to be anyway.
Another interesting thing is that different frameworks have different philosophies around how software should be written. And based on these philosophies, they make different trade-offs. So whether a framework is going to simplify your life or complicate it far more, kind of depends on the software you're trying to build, how aligned you are to those philosophies, the team you're working with, and so on. And for me, knowing these alternatives and their trade-offs helps me choose the right tool for the job.
I think there's also something of an argument to be made for choosing a framework that is the leading edge. And one reason why you want to do that, I mean, well, some of the things you'll see in ServiceStack and in Nancy that we're about to talk about, WebAPI is kind of picked some of the best things from some of these frameworks and adopted them. So there's something to be said for seeing those things before other folks do and being exposed to newer ideas more often, and not just through the filter of what people pick up and decide to copy from these open source frameworks, but go live on the edge and see the new ideas as they're happening. And some of them will be good and some of them are bad. And so that's kind of good for our critical thinking skills and our critical reasoning skills and to test the way we think about software. And it exposes us to lots more information as we think as architects, right? Like what did work, what didn't work is kind of good to know. If we only kind of see the successful parts from open source come in, we're literally missing some information and we're not training our brains in the same way we could.
So we touched on the differences in philosophy and the trade-offs before. One of the important ways in which frameworks differ is how lean they are. Some frameworks try to provide you the minimum possible while getting out of your way, while still others try to provide you everything in the entire stack, from HTTP endpoints to an opinionated view on how you should be reading from your repositories.
You'll see that one of the trade-offs you can look at is sort of, is it dynamic or is it more strongly typed? And that's sort of a dimension that any framework can choose to be somewhere along that. Do we want to be somewhere in the middle where we're sort of paying attention to both, or do we want to be sort of strongly typed and opinionated about that, or more on the dynamic side?
Yeah, I think we are at a place where every framework claims that it's testable, but frameworks still differ on what that really means to them. Some frameworks make it really, really easy to test your entire stack, while others require you to spin up things like an entire browser before you can test your endpoints. So it's really important for you to be aware of all the options available to you and find something that aligns with what you want to build.
I think there's another dimension around those trade-offs around how explicit do you need to be versus how much ceremony do you expect from a developer. And you'll see in the slides that we're going to show, in some of the frameworks, they very much have an opinion on let's keep it low ceremony, and in other frameworks, the value of that explicitness is amplified, right? Some frameworks tend to kind of value, no, let's be explicit, and that's good, that's control, whereas other frameworks kind of value, nah, we kind of know what they want, let's be low ceremony about it. So we'll see those trade-offs in action today. So we're going to use some code examples. We're going to show some actual code at some point and not just be talking heads. we'll be talking heads with code, which will be better. You'll see. All the code samples that we're going to show today are from a really cool website called todobackend.com. And our friend Pete Hodgson has made this website. So you know how JavaScript frameworks kind of all say, hey, let's go implement a to-do, and then everyone can see that Knockout is clearly old news and the new hotness is something else. So to-do backend is like that. It's like the analogy for that for server-side frameworks. So instead of building different clients and different Java-side frameworks, you build backends for the exact same client, and this is what the client looks like. Pete gives that to you in the form of a series of specs, JavaScript specs, which literally run on the code to like assert that they're all the same. So luckily, todobackend.com has 3 C# examples. One is WebAPI, one is ServiceStack, and one is Nancy. And that is very convenient for what we want to do today. So a lot of the code that you'll see will come directly from todobackend.com.
Awesome. So let's get to know Nancy. So Nancy is a super simple, very lightweight framework designed for building web services. It's been around for a while now. I think the first release was in 2011, and the last release came out just last month. The framework is designed to run on .NET on Mono, which means it runs on pretty much every platform. And it's open source. It has a large open source community, and it's MIT licensed. So you can go and contribute if you want. So the philosophy of Nancy is best exemplified by a phrase coined by its creators, which is the super duper happy path. For the Nancy devs, what this means is that you should be able to go from zero code to a working application within minutes. And the principles that Nancy uses to guide itself to make this possible is that things should just work. As someone who's getting started with the framework, you shouldn't have to spend time configuring a lot of code or getting the framework to recognize the code you've written before you get an endpoint up and running. Nancy does that by using conventions over configuration, by auto-discovering your dependencies, and using sensible defaults wherever possible. Another guiding principle was that even though Nancy provides you a lot of functionality out of the box, these functionalities should be easy to configure. If you want to change something, you should be able to do that without having to fight the framework. And Nancy does that by using dependency injection pretty much everywhere and providing very clear extensible points for its API. Another big driving factor for Nancy devs was low ceremony. What this means is that when you're writing code using Nancy, you should be focusing on your business logic. You shouldn't really have to spend a lot of time dealing with the framework. The framework should just get out of the way and let you do your thing. And Nancy has made some pretty interesting design decisions which make this possible. And we'll be talking about them a bit later. And the final driving factor was low friction. And this talks to the fact that during the time that you really need to use the Nancy API should guide you in the right direction. You shouldn't have to spend a lot of time struggling to figure out how an API works, how you can make it do what you want. And Nancy enables that by providing a DSL for pretty much everything. From how the endpoints are defined, to how content negotiation happens, to configuring the framework, to writing tests. There's a DSL for everything in Nancy. So, how do you get started with Nancy? Step 1, you install the Nancy NuGet package. Step 2, you create a module. Modules in Nancy are the places where all your behavior lies. This is where you define your endpoints. And a module in Nancy inherits from the Nancy module base class. And that's pretty much all you need to do to create a module. As soon as the class inherits from Nancy module, Nancy will auto-discover it during startup and make the endpoints available to you. The endpoints themselves are defined in the constructor of the module. So here in the example, you can see we have 2 endpoints defined. An endpoint in Nancy consists of the HTTP verb. In this case, it's get. A URL pattern to match. So in our case, we are matching the to-dos. And an action that gets executed when this route is matched. So you can specify, as you can see, we have specified our action as a lambda. So it's pretty straightforward. The first endpoint will return all the 2 items I have in my repository. The second endpoint will return a specific one. Now, one thing to note here, worth calling out, is that nowhere in our action are we telling you the format of the response. So is it going to be a JSON? Is it XML? Is it returning a web page? And the reason we don't have to do that is Nancy's conventions. So Nancy automatically tries to infer the type of your response based on the request it's gotten. So if your request says that it's expecting HTML or JSON, Nancy will automatically convert your models to the correct format and send them off. If the request says that it's expecting HTML, Nancy will use its conventions to find a view file for this route, pass this model to the view, render it, and then send it back. So once again, this is a good example of the low ceremony approach. The framework has gotten out of your way. You just write your business logic. I can cover that after the talk in the question answer section. Okay, so moving on. This is a slightly more fleshed out approach module. So you can see we have routes defined for different HTTP verbs. Pretty straightforward as before. The example highlights a few of the things you can do with the URL pattern matching. Nancy allows you to use regexes if you want. You can also provide a conditional. So in the second example, if you see, along with the route, we have provided a conditional method that returns true or false. If the method returns true, that route is matched, and the action is executed. Another thing is you don't have to, this being C#, you don't really have to use lambdas if you don't want to. You can directly write a method. If you notice, we have a getToDo's method defined there. As long as the method takes in a dynamic dictionary of parameters and returns a dynamic value, Nancy can work with it. So we saw how easy it is to get up and running with Nancy. But just because it's easy doesn't really mean it's difficult to customize. Nancy, the framework itself, can be thought of as a bunch of different functionality composed together to make a framework. So out of the box, Nancy provides a lot of default things like the model binders, the view engines, authentication mechanisms. And all of these can be replaced or overridden by you as you want. The Nancy component that's responsible for doing this is known as the bootstrapper. Every Nancy application will have a bootstrapper. If you don't define one, Nancy will just use the default bootstrapper that puts in place all the Nancy conventions. The bootstrapper can be overridden. So if you look at this example, you have a bootstrapper providing you a method to override the application pipeline configuration, and another to override the conventions that Nancy provides you built in. Another way in which Nancy enables extensibility is by the fact that it's completely host agnostic. Nancy, the framework, doesn't really care where it's running. There are hosts available to make Nancy run as part of the ASP.NET pipeline or on WCF. Nancy is OWIN compatible, so it can run wherever you have OWIN compatible hosts. So you can have Nancy running on the console. It can self-host. You can have Nancy running as part of a Windows service, as a desktop app. And keep in mind that Nancy is, again, running both on .NET and Mono, so it doesn't really care which operating system it's on either. And part of this flexibility and easy customization is that there are a lot of options available to customize Nancy in its ecosystem. Chances are that if there is a favorite view engine you want to use, a favorite IOC library, a favorite authentication mechanism, there is already a NuGet package for it. And generally using them is as simple as pulling in the right NuGet package with minor configuration. Another side effect of Nancy's design is that the framework is completely testable. The Nancy testing package actually allows you to do in-memory testing of the full stack. So you never have to launch a browser or deal with flaky browser behavior to test your endpoints. Another thing the language provides is a DSL for configuring your tests and also for your asserts. So this is a sample test for Nancy. In this test, we want to hit our to-dos endpoint and make sure it returns all our to-dos. So the browser object is something that Nancy provides that creates an in-memory testable space for your entire stack. We tell it that we want to test our to-do module. We call out the endpoint we want to hit. In this case, it's /todos, and how we want to hit it. So here we are making an HTTP request. The framework allows you to test it with an AJAX request or an HTTPS request. And then there's a DSL that we can use to assert the request or the body that's returned. The DSL is pretty flexible. You can assert even components like which CSS classes are being passed in or various components of the web page. So I think it's worth reiterating that while Nancy is very simple and easy to use, it's not really a toy. It's been ready for production for quite a few years. There are a lot of Nancy applications out there in the wild, running both on Windows and Unix operating systems. And ThoughtWorks has had a lot of experience, a lot of really good, successful experiences with Nancy. We've been using it at a number of our clients. One thing that comes out again and again, patterns we see when people use Nancy, is that people really like the fact that it's easy to get up and running with, but also it's pretty expressive. And I think everyone loves this self-hosting nature, because the biggest win people consider is that you no longer have to work with IIS if you don't want to. Due to its very lightweight nature, as we see the microservices architecture becoming more popular, it seems to be a very sweet spot for Nancy to hit. And a lot of our projects, microservices project in the .NET space, have been looking at Nancy as an option. But keep in mind, Nancy isn't your only option, and here's Kyle to talk to you about what else you can do.
Thanks, Tanuj. Sorry, earlier on that question around lifecycle, can I don't know the Nancy answer for sure, but in what way are you looking for lifecycle, in case I can answer about ServiceStack? Right. Right, so just to repeat for the recording, we passed in the repo and other things, so that kind of assumes that the lifecycle is per request. Right, okay, good point. In ServiceStack, it is a per request lifecycle, if I recall correctly. Yeah, on each one. So, but let's start sort of at the beginning as well. So ServiceStack was started back in 2008 by a guy named Demis Bellat. And Demis was really unhappy. He actually started noodling around. It just wasn't called ServiceStack before then, in like 2006. And he was working at BBC at the time. He was building web services for them. And he was really, really unhappy with what he was seeing coming out of Microsoft. I think it was Microsoft Remoting at the time, which is something I never had the pleasure of using. But then subsequently after that, of course, they came out with WCF. And I use a lot of WCF on projects. And I know what's wrong with that. I can tell you in lots and lots of words what I think is wrong with that. And the letters XML will come up quite a bit. There's so much of it. It's terrible. And Demis thought so too. So he was looking for a better way to do web frameworks than what was available at the time. So this was kind of a scratch your own itch kind of project. One of the things he did next is he built this example for ServiceStack that was a Stack Overflow example. It was a Stack Overflow clone in a ServiceStack backend. And I always imagine that's what got him the attention of the Stack Overflow folks. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but he ended up working for them for a couple of years. And Stack Overflow to this day continues to use the ServiceStack framework in production. So it's also like validated, verified, in prod kind of stuff. You know, Stack Overflow, of course, 45 million unique users per month. They're a top 200 website. They're hardcore. If Stack Overflow can do that, I'm sure it can make the website for the bank that I'm working at the end of the day. But one thing I need to talk about with ServiceStack, unfortunately, is licensing. So ServiceStack, I would call it, is it open source? Is it source open? Somewhere in there? Like if you go to github.com, you will see all of the source code. None of it is hidden. And if you would like to contribute to it, you are welcome to do that. And in fact, there's about 215 contributors on GitHub right now. Though points were made yesterday that those aren't all real contributors, but you know what I mean. There's definitely people committing and contributing to the code. Some of those folks probably committed back in the version 3 days where it was fully GPL. Now it's under a different license. So what happens if you just pull ServiceStack down from NuGet right now, you're going to get an evaluation license. And that evaluation license gives you the ability to write up to 10 data transfer objects, and we'll talk more about what that means in a minute, or up to 10 objects in your ORM, which we'll talk about how that works too. But good news, never fear, an ND license is only $299. So that's a named developer, lifetime, $299. There's options for business and so on. This can also be seen as a strength. If you're working in the kind of enterprise where they say, couldn't possibly do that, no support, there is in fact support. You're going to be paying for it, you're going to get it. You get so many incidents per year, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that I really like best about ServiceStack is that it's very full-featured, right? I mean, on that sort of trade-off slider that we talked about earlier, it's definitely chosen the path of making sure that it's got everything in the box that you're going to need. That being said, you can switch things out, right? So it comes with ORM Lite, which is a micro ORM. I think it's actually a port of a Java ORM called micro ORM, or sorry, called ORM Lite. An ORM Lite happens to be very functional and very, 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 very fast. It's not as fully functional as Entity Framework, but it is much faster than Entity Framework. And if it's in the box. If you want to switch it out, you can. No problem with that. It also comes with an inversion of control container called Func. Func has also been sort of tuned for performance, and it's a really nice little IOC. And ServiceStack by default wires everything up together with Func. It also includes ServiceStack.text, which is CSV, JSV, SOAP. It handles sort of all your serialization. Sorry, SOAP is more things than just serialization, but it handles XML and JSON and so on. And it does so really, really fast. And ServiceStack.text gets used by a lot of projects out there, even if they're not using ServiceStack. And you can do that. You can just pull down that component if you want. You don't have to have the whole framework. And if you really want, I suppose you could use like JSON.net or something like that, or Newtonsoft. Right. It also includes a Redis library, and that Redis library happens to be one of the nicer ones in the C# community, which is nice. It includes a C# client, and that C# client is a great way to connect to the services you're creating. And it can actually, if you need to get to the point where you're testing things, C# client can be a great way to test some of the stuff that you're building. Recently, they added Razor support. So at this point, you can now build like full stack apps. Maybe we should call it AppStack instead of ServiceStack at this point, right? I mean, it's not just backend services anymore. Right. So performance is definitely, yeah. The question was, is there any similarity or lineage between ServiceStack Redis and Stack Exchange Redis? I'm going to say I don't know. Maybe. It's open source. Maybe they started from there. I wouldn't know. Is someone shaking their head no? I'm not really sure. Okay. Probably not. Yeah. Or no relationship, as our colleague's saying. Yeah. So ServiceStack is super, super performant. So this is a performance graph from 2014. If any of you have kind of heard a little bit about ServiceStack, they were doing the podcast rounds back in 2011. You've probably all seen there was like 3 or 4 benchmarks that they did back then saying that they were the fastest at everything. That's still true. This is an updated benchmark from 2014. And what this benchmark is doing, you can tell by the eye chart I put in front of you, right? You can all read that. So what we're doing here is we're taking 25,000 rows of SQL Express and turning it all into JSON. So on this end, we've got ServiceStack, ORM Lite, and ServiceStack.text, 245 milliseconds. And over there, fully almost 10 times worse, is Entity Framework and JSON.net. So, I mean, these other various combinations are combinations of other open source and commercial offerings put together doing the exact same job. So performance is still definitely in the box, and it's still definitely one of the main features that they work on a lot. At one point, it used to get said that the base class library is one hell of a piece of software, right? The BCL is really finely tuned, but some of the stuff like data contract that came with WCF or some of the other parts that come with some of the frameworks which are just outside of the BCL, they needed some performance tuning at one time. So that, I think ServiceStack is somewhat in reaction to that, making sure everything's nicely tuned. So ServiceStack also is very opinionated, right? Which I think is good. And in that, if you share its opinion, then you're going to get along with it. If you don't share its opinion, it's probably not for you, and that's good. That's better than it being generic and not really knowing. It's being kind of wishy-washy. So the opinions that it's got, let's go through them so that we can kind of understand what we're looking at. ServiceStack definitely falls on the strongly typed side of things. It's not messing around about the fact that it thinks you want static classes. We can talk more about, or sorry, not static classes, but static types. We can talk a little bit more about what we mean by that in a minute. It definitely errs on the side of convention over configuration. If you do need to configure it, you're probably going to write a little bit of code to change some config. But for the most part, you're not going to have to do that because the conventions it comes with out of the box are pretty good at the end of the day. Little things like cores, enabling cores is adding a plugin. Sometimes you'll end up having to do things like that, but it's no problem. The plugins are there. It's easy to do. I would say it's also service-oriented, right? A lot of frameworks are sort of HTTP-centric, or really maybe they're an MVC model, and that's sort of their center of gravity. I would say that ServiceStack is service-oriented. It's kind of an SOA system, if you will. Don't think like old school SOA, but it's definitely trying to help you build services, right? And that's the thing it's centric around. In fact, it's not just HTTP accessible, right? Like HTTP is a first-class citizen, and it handles HTTP very, very well. But also, if you hook up to the messaging capabilities in Redis, you can start publishing and subscribing on channels, and it can start to pick those up, and all of a sudden you're doing messaging with ServiceStack. Your code might look a tiny bit different, and we can kind of show you what that'll look like in a little bit, but it's really service-oriented. It's not necessarily HTTP or MVC only. And it's following a pattern. It wants to be RESTful for sure, and it's borrowing something that Martin Fowler talks about around being a remote facade and oriented towards a remote facade. And what that pattern is talking about is anytime you need to, use your battery to spin up a radio to talk to the internet on a mobile device, or any time you're in an operating system on a computer and you actually need to leave, not just the confines of this machine, but go out across the internet, that's kind of a big deal. And when you're doing that, you should think of that remote facade as something that's somewhat expensive to talk to. So you should be thoughtful about the requests you send and thoughtful about the responses that you get back, so that you're not sort of constantly round tripping. And that's very different from like what we saw yesterday with Falcor, if anyone saw the Falcor presentation. So somewhat diametrically opposed. They're probably good at different things at the end of the day. Not that one's right or wrong, but they're just good at different things. And of course, clean and testable. And I think the code is super clean. And testability has been a first-class citizen since day one. There's ways to do unit testing with services. There's ways to do integration testing, acceptance testing, contracts testing, functional testing, whatever you want to do. You can self-host, so it's easy to do anything in memory, just like with Nancy. So let's look at what that sort of object-oriented kind of approach looks like when you start to apply that to a web framework. So what we're looking at here is a request. This is an HTTP request. And in idiomatic service stack, one of the things that you're doing is you are modeling the request that you're making, right? Tanuj was talking a moment ago about how in Nancy, that's going to be just sort of a dynamic that we deal with over the wire, and whatever we get in, we're going to just look at that as sort of a bag of parameters. It is idiomatic service stack, and in fact, it's required that you model the requests that you're going to expect to get in. So what we get is we actually, our route annotation lives above the data transfer object that represents our model, right? So this is a model for a view item request. If someone was going to come and say, oh, I've got item ID, GUID, because it's a string, because in this application we were using GUIDs instead of numbers, then hand me that GUID and I'm going to go get it for you. But this is what that request gets modeled like. Okay, no big deal, single string, that's it. But it's very opinionated. We go to the point of making classes for each one. So what does a service look like that knows how to process that? So each service either extends a base class called service or implements an interface called iService, which is a bit of a marker so that it knows where to find your services in the assembly. But if you take if you go ahead and take an inheritance on service, you get some nice goodies. You get a couple of different methods which are useful and things like that. So, but you can keep it clean if you want and just implement the interface instead. So what our to-do service is doing is we have a method called get, and we know this is an HTTP service because we've named our method get. And that get processes, it's expecting a view item request. That's exactly what it knows how to do. So when ServiceStack binder takes a look at incoming requests, it can say, okay, cool, I have one of those, and I can see that the verb on this thing is a get, and so I know what to do. I'm going to wire that request up with that method, and then I'm going to do whatever in here. As also, you start to see a little bit about how ORM Lite works. We won't go into a lot of details on ORM Lite, but there will be little pieces of it showing up in the code example. So this starts to get a little bit cooler when you're doing something a little more complex. So let's say one of the things in the to-do specifications, if you want to go implement todobackend.com with your web framework of choice, you're going to have to handle a patch request, right? And patch is sort of an HTTP verb which kind of exists. I don't know if it's actually in the RFCs, but if you can convince something in JavaScript to do it, you can do it. So, and what this patch request is doing is you might just only get through the completed variable. Completed indicates whether this to-do item has been done or not. If I click the little check mark saying done, then completed is going to be set to true. Or I might just get order. And thinking back to our application, you can drag the to-dos around. So like 1, 2, 3 is the order that they're going to show up in that list. So, but what you can do with this patch request, what you're expecting, what the specs expect, is that if you only get the title, I'm only going to change the title, right? I'm not going to go dig that thing up from the hard drive and set the item to null and set the completed to null and set the order to null. I'm going to only change the title. That's what I'm expecting in my specification. And you can see that we're expecting that at a certain route and with a certain verb. So what the service can do is then say, all right, cool, I know what I'm getting in, but when I just see that title, I'm not going to get confused and think this is something else. I still know that this is a patch item request because it meets the criteria set out in that model. And when the request comes in, we're going to run this really, I want to call it poorly named, but I can't think of a better name for this method. This populate with non-default parameters, populate with non-default values. So this method does exactly what it says it does. It uses all those words, unfortunately. But populate with non-default values, what it's doing is it's saying, oh, I only see the title here. So that's going to be the only thing I'm going to copy over the object that I fetch from the disk. So it kind of knows what it needs to do. And I like to highlight this because the corresponding Nancy service for the exact same part of the spec, it's like 3 if statements. If it's been provided, then, if it's been provided, then. So populate with non-default values is kind of handling all that for you, which is kind of nice. So you kind of see a little bit about how ServiceStack gets to be kind of elegant at times, I think.
So let's take a quick look at some of the big ways in which these frameworks differ from each other. So one of the most obvious differences between ServiceStack and Nancy is their opinions around static typing. Right? Like ServiceStack is very, very clear that for any request you make, any response you give, everything needs to be strongly typed. Whereas Nancy kind of falls on the other side of the line. Part of the way Nancy is easy to get up and running with is because it doesn't really make you sit out and list down all your requests and responses. It gives you a bunch of dynamic values, expects dynamics and returns, and tries to infer as much as it can about what you want to do.
If we compare, so again, these are exactly the same parts of the spec for the different frameworks, which is nice. So if we look at the way that WebAPI kind of handles the same sort of job, you can see its MVC heritage here, right? Like what we've got is we've got a method call, and there's different parameters, and the first one's going to be the ID, and that's going to get mapped back to some part of the URL, and the second one's going to be the model. And I mean, am I arguing against commas? Am I saying that we should never accept more than one parameter? Well, I mean, maybe that's a little extreme. But I do think that ServiceStack's approach of modeling the request and having all of that be in one data transfer object keeps things a little bit cleaner, and you might just end up in a situation where you have a little fewer method calls and a little less RPC-like. Yeah? So routing is our next bit, and let me see if I can understand. It's Mark, right? The question is around. The question is also if the request object has the route on it. If the request object has the route, yep. That's how it's choosing which service to look at by the parameters it's being routed. Yep. Does that mean that the request object can only be used for one route? No. You could just stack. So one thing you can do convention routing and get rid of the attributes altogether. The other thing you can do is just stack attributes all day long, if that's what you want to do. So obviously you wouldn't want too many, but yeah, you can just stack multiple attributes on there. So those classes, those models that we put together can be used in multiple places. But if you have like a post and a get, and they're both expecting the same model, right? And then only one's going to get triggered on the post, and only the other one's going to get triggered on the get, right? But if you just have, you can also say any. You can create a method called any, and like if anything comes in with any verb, it's going to get into that method. And that way you can handle, in fewer methods, you can handle more different kinds of things. No, you only have one service per assembly, and that has to own its own. Yeah, correct. It wouldn't be only in one service. So the next thing we want to kind of further this discussion around routing and how they work, we didn't want to highlight the differences there, again, because it's one of the ways in which they're different. So obviously in ServiceStack, you've got, again, like we talked about, you've got this strongly typed data transfer object, and the routes go on the DTO, right? Whereas when you look at the WebAPI version of the same one, it's much more MVC oriented in that you've got sort of this route attribute over your controller method as opposed to over that data transfer object.
Hopefully this gives you a good overview of these two frameworks. Our hope in giving this talk was that the next time you guys have to build a new web application or create a new API, you'll go and try out some of these new frameworks, see what else is in the ecosystem, instead of just sticking with ASP.NET.
Right, and then kind of this is that moment where we build our community to look more like what Java does or Ruby does and have more and more options. So let's purposely explore. And one of the things to think about, both of these projects, as Fubu and as with Freya and with all the other Valcor, I'm sure this is true. But for sure, the two that we're presenting have really good documentation, and there's really good tooling out there too. Like Tanuj was mentioning that there's a ReSharper module for Nancy that makes it easier to work with. And there's a Visual Studio extension for ServiceStack. If you pull that down, it'll automatically create new ServiceStack projects. And there's even sort of an add reference thing, which I'm not sure how I feel about that, but there's like an add service reference thing for ServiceStack now. And if that's what you want, you can do that. You don't have to, please, but you can. So there's good tooling and there's good documentation out there for both of those, and that makes it safe to explore. But not only that, we want to explore, right? Whether it's safe or not, we want to be being purposeful about being exploratory on purpose.
Yeah, and speaking of exploring new things, I think this is an excellent time to plug the ThoughtWorks radar. So this is a document we put out, I think, every quarter, where we talk about languages, frameworks, technologies, and techniques that we, as a company, have had experience with on client projects. The innermost circle of the radar lists technologies and items that we used successfully in production and that we wholeheartedly recommend that people try out. Items in the outer rings are things that we are looking at, trying them out, we aren't too sure about. And items in the final ring are things that we've used, and we definitely recommend that you don't. So Nancy made it to the innermost adopt ring earlier this year, hence this talk. But this radar is also a really good way for you to find out what else is available in the ecosystem, things you can try out, and hopefully give us feedback. Thank you.
So if it makes it to adopt, like that's kind of saying we've had multiple projects over multiple months or possibly years in production, and it's working well, and everyone feels that way, and it's very, very solid. Whereas like the other rings, trial and assess, are a little more like saying, cool, we think this is really neat, but we're not especially sure yet. Like, but we think got this goodness over here. Whereas the furthest out ring, hold, means, oh yeah, we've had problems with that. Don't do that. But absence of it on the radar doesn't mean anything necessarily good or bad. It just means that we haven't had a lot of chatter around it. So ServiceStack's absence isn't a bad thing. It's okay. So we want to do like a quick show of hands. So based on what we've seen today and based on what you've read up until now and what you already know, if you were going to start a project tomorrow, would you consider using Nancy? Show of hands. Okay, so like 16, 17 people. So same question for ServiceStack. Okay, cool, non-zero, I like it, good. Yay, they're both non-zero, yay, see they're the same. No, but it's like 17 to 8 roughly. So okay, cool, nice, good, right? They're both very good at different things. And maybe try them both, spike them both out for your next project, depending on what you're doing. So yeah, I guess last thing, questions? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, so the question is, with Nancy, how different is it from Sinatra?
Are you following the same roadmap as far as future, or has it totally
So the we question, neither Tanuj or I are core contributors or at all contributors to those projects.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, Nancy used Sinatra for its inspiration, but it isn't really tracking Sinatra in any way. So it was an initial trigger for a framework like this in the .NET world, but since then they've been pretty much going their own way, looking for feedback from the community.
Right, so the question was around ServiceStack, what does the license include? The $299 Indie license includes everything. If you just want the serializers or if you just want the Redis client, if I recall, those are like $49 and $149 respectively, something like that. So those are even cheaper from there. But they don't give you everything else, they just give you that part. But yeah, you can buy those parts individually. Thank you. Cameron? Okay, so the question for ServiceStack, what does a more enterprise level, I'm glad I studied this. I made the slide that had all the pricing, and I realized, okay, I'm not going to put that on here, but now you're asking, so maybe. So business, so the Indie gets you a named developer. Indie is good for like, hey, I'm Kyle, and Kyle gets that license. But if you are, I don't know, McKesson, maybe that's not so good. Maybe you want, people which is developer one kind of thing. You want 30 licenses for the company. So that license is $9.99. But the other thing which differentiates it is not just that it's not a named license, but also you get like 4 support incidents per year or something, whereas the $299 one does not. It is $9.99 one time, yes, and that buys you a year's worth of support updates. But the license is perpetual. Yep. Yes, yeah, the ND 299, you can deploy it to thousands of cores if you want to. And if you want a per core model, there is one out there for like $490 a core. You can do that model if that's what you want instead. Correct, yeah, they have all the ways to take your money, yeah. I'm starting to sound like a sales guy for them right now. Yeah. Yeah, if you just pull it down to NuGet, that's what you get. Oh, no, it's forever. The evaluation goes forever. So in ORM Lite, you model your tables with classes. You're limited to 10. In ServiceStack, you model with data transfer objects, your requests and responses. You're limited to like 20 or something, right? So that's the way the evaluation works. You can use it forever. The only one time-limited license I'm aware of in the evaluation, ServiceStack Redis, is only 6,000 Redis calls per hour. So, yeah.
They also throttle on the .text.
Do they throttle on the deck text? I'm sure they do. Yeah. Yeah.
The second question I have is there video support baked into either of the frameworks or those separate modules you have to?
IDEO?
Videos?
Oh, right. Sorry. Hypertext is the application or engine of a. Does it care if you use Hate OAS?
Nancy doesn't care. I'm not entirely sure if there are any plugins available that specifically guide you down that particular path. Nancy can be configured to make it fully HATEOS compatible, but out of the box, I don't think Nancy cares. It's too prescriptive for it.
I'm not sure if ServiceStack has like a plugin which makes that easier and supports the development or not. But yeah, it certainly doesn't stop you from doing it. Yeah, but there are lots of plugins for both of these, right? There are rich plugin and extension ecosystems for both, for sure. So I'm sure they wouldn't mind the contribution either. Great questions, guys, so far. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. Thanks, everybody.